Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we are going to be talking about Essential Marvel 2-in-1, Volume 1. And here's the front cover and the back cover, which is actually what the cover of the original first issue of Marvel 2-in-1 looked like. But you got the Thing and the Hulk on one side, and the Thing versus Man-Thing on the back. So Marvel 2-in-1 was essentially a team-up title starring the Thing, aka Ben Grimm from the Fantastic Four, in a series of stories in which he would, team up with usually a different character almost every issue, throughout the Marvel Universe, that is. And the whole concept started off in issues 11 and 12 of Marvel Feature, and then from there the series Marvel 2-in-1 started off, and this particular trade paperback collects 11 and 12 of Marvel Feature, Marvel 2-in-1 1 through 20, 22 through 25, and it's the first annual of the series, as well as Marvel Team Up number 47 and Fantastic Four annual number 11. So it was really fun, looking through these, because a while back I had been able to read a couple of the individual issues, but not in context of, say, the rest of the series. But to be fair, for the most part, a lot of the stories tend to be kind of standalone, but there are a few exceptions in where you have a few story arcs in which the plot thread is resolved, say, within 3 issues instead of just 1 issue. But there are some elements that kind of carry over throughout the series. But one of the things that was fascinating is seeing several characters who, say, don't, maybe they didn't exactly have their own series, or if they did, said series wasn't, say, in the spotlight as, say, other top tier Marvel titles were at the time. And so it was interesting seeing Ben Grimm interact with some of these lesser known characters. And I also liked how Ben Grimm was, despite the fact that he's essentially a rocky monster, I mean, he's got the soul and personality of a blue-collar individual, which makes him relatable in a lot of ways. Although I should say that he was a top-notch pilot, so just because he had kind of a blue-collar sensibility, that doesn't mean that he was not a gadgeteer whiz in other ways. But I liked how for this particular team-up title, they went ahead and got arguably the most relatable character from the Fantastic Four, and had him headlining a series, because as much as I like the Fantastic Four, I mean, all the members of the original members of the team are cool in their own ways. I mean, Reed Richards, aka Mr. Fantastic, Susan Storm, Invisible Woman, Johnny Storm, the Human Torch. I mean, they're all great characters, but it just the Thing, though, you could tell that when he was created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, they put a lot more, I guess you could say, heart and soul into his character. So even though he was the one who looked the least human, he came across as the most human in terms of personality and what have you. So seeing him get to stretch his legs, not wholly separate from the Fantastic Four, but at the same time, being front and center, in his own book, was really cool. And, he's the kind of guy who, I mean, as I said, is very relatable. And so even though he's, stuck in a situation wherein, due to, being mutated by cosmic rays along with the rest of the Fantastic Four, I mean, he's got, super strength. I mean, he's very durable. I mean, he can take a lot of damage. I mean, he's strong enough to go toe to toe with the Incredible Hulk, if that tells you anything. But at the same time, though, I mean, he's a lot more laid back when it comes to, say, the chaos of living in the Marvel universe. And whenever he and his girlfriend Alicia Masters, the blind sculptress, are together, I mean, you definitely have some very humanizing, moments with him. I mean, I should say with the two of them together. But I guess you could say, the Thing is very humanized throughout the whole book, simply because of, my aforementioned, description of his character. But it's fascinating, seeing the sort of, blue collar sensibility interacting with, the rest of the fantastical elements of the Marvel universe. But one of the things that I sort of had a problem with was that it may be less so the series, but and more so, this particular collection. But oftentimes there are stories that end on a cliffhanger, and these are stories within the Marvel 2-in-1 title. But then they'll say, read issue such and such of Daredevil to see what happens next, or read such and such or read let's see, like the Defenders, to see what happens to Valkyrie. And so, but the problem is, those particular issues in which the Thing is involved, as the editorial department, clearly states at the end of, the Marvel 2-in-1 issues, the issues that the plot lines are resolved in aren't not included in this volume, which makes it very frustrating, because I mean, the Valkyrie story in particular was actually a pretty cool story. I mean, it starts off with the Doctor Strange story, and then the Thing and Doctor Strange end up teaming up with the Valkyrie, and there's a rather fascinating story with her character and, the nature of her true identity and what have you. And I actually wanted to see what happened with that, but unfortunately, the issue of the Defenders that storyline was resolved in is not included here. So it's like there are several cliffhangers that unfortunately turn up in this particular book, and we don't get to see the outcome of them. And it's not like, I necessarily feel inclined to, go out, looking for a lot of these old school individual issues, because depending on what kind of condition they're in, I mean, they might be really expensive, and so it would be kind of annoying, going from this and then having to go to the individual issue that storyline concludes in. So it would have been nice had they included the outside issues in which these plot threads were resolved in, but alas, that was not the case. And also, another thing about this book, which in some ways it's a good thing and others not such a good thing, at least by modern standards, is that on one hand, old school Marvel kicks ass. Okay, I mean, there's a lot of vitality, a lot of energy, a lot of originality, and the whole idea, I think, was just to tell a good story. And for the most part, the stories in here tend to be really good, and at least in the sense of, say, writing and illustrating, because the writing itself is not bad. But unfortunately, though, if you're coming at things from a modern day perspective in terms of writing, or I guess you could say storytelling in general, having evolved long past the 70s, then I think if you come back and look at something from that time period, I mean, you might be able to appreciate how things were different. But at the same time, there's no denying that in terms of, say, characterization and interpersonal interaction and character development, time has basically shown that for the most part, storytelling has evolved a lot since the 70s. Because when it comes to, say, like the main character, Ben Grimm, the Thing, I mean, his characterization, regardless of who's writing the stories, because there are several writers, it's not just one writer in this particular volume, but the creative teams do a really good job of handling Ben Grimm, but when it comes to, say, interactions with, say, for example, everyday people, or just say incidental characters, and sometimes even guest stars, the writing, can sometimes be less than stellar, unfortunately. So, like, maybe it's one of those things where it was good for back then, but for now, it's one of those things where you could just tell that writing has improved immensely since then. But so your mileage may vary as far as that goes. Like, if you can look at this and understand that storytelling was different back then it has improved immensely since then you might be able to just take it in stride. But I have to admit that there were moments where I was like, gosh, this writing sucks. I mean, I hate to say that, because there are some, the writers in here are, in general, they tend to be very good comic book writers. But unfortunately, though, I guess it's just the style in which it was written tends to pale in comparison to some of the stuff that came afterwards, later on as time went on. But on the other hand, though, the artwork in general tends to be very well done. And one of the good things about these essential lines is that, so while in terms of narrative, the narrative tends to be choppy with these essential collections, unfortunately, in the sense of, say, the aforementioned lack of outside books that were part of certain storylines within this series in question. I will say that the black and white format of these essential books allows the reader to really appreciate the amount of effort and detail that went into putting pictures on page for these comic books. And especially in the 70s, it's like the artists, or just the creative team, and the art team in general, the pencilers, the inkers, they really had to go all in on working together. And because they didn't have fancy computers back then like they do today. So I mean, that effort really paid off. And so if it's like you look through the pages, I mean, you can tell that you're going to get your money's worth, just in terms of visual kapow factor. So while the storytelling, or I should say the writing, tends to be kind of hit and miss, just based on how dated it is, and also this particular volume sort of lacking in terms of I guess you could say making sure that the readers are familiar with certain plot lines, or certain characters, so that way, because the volume, it's basically reprinting the stories as they were. And so if you're someone who read comic books in the 70s, then you're probably gonna have no problem figuring out what's going on with certain storylines or certain characters within this collection. But on the other hand, though, if you're someone like myself who is more familiar with, say, comic books from the 90s or early 2000s and what have you, then a lot of the references that are thrown out in this particular volume to events that happened in, say, books at the Fantastic Four, or just other comic books in general, you're probably going to be a little confused. And so that is kind of a downside, unfortunately. And it would have been nice if there was something to, I guess you could say, help the reader get familiar with certain events and what have you. But to be fair, though, sometimes the creative teams, they do a good enough job of introducing certain characters within this particular book, and basically, making sure that the reader understands who the characters are and what their story is. And so it's kind of hit and miss in that regard, sort of 50-50. But I mean, some of the stories really did stand out in that regard. One of my personal favorites was a storyline wherein you know there or he teams up with I should say they have the Thing teaming up with a character by the name of Scarecrow, or I should say the Scarecrow. And he was a horror character that was only in, say, a couple of issues in other titles, horror titles, I should say, and then in Marvel 2-in-1, his storyline was kind of resolved, but then he wasn't heard from again for several years until the 90s came around. Then he turned up in Doctor Strange, but and they changed his name to the Straw Man instead of the Scarecrow, because I mean, you have like two other characters called Scarecrow, and they're both criminals. One's a homicidal maniac, and the other one is sort of a crazed criminal mastermind in DC Comics. So yeah, I understand why they changed his name to the Straw Man eventually, but for the time though, I mean, this was a pretty spooky character, but at the same time, I like the fact that just because he was within the horror realm of Marvel, they made a point to show that he was ultimately on the side of good, even though he was a sinister character, and they did a good enough job with his one-shot story of explaining what happened in his prior appearances, so that way his struggle against certain demonic forces didn't come out of left field. And so when the Thing's involved in it, it's kind of like, for him, it's just kind of another day at the office, except another day in the office is always atypical. I mean, you never know what you're going to get with the Marvel Universe, and the Thing is kind of the living embodiment of that. But it really depends on luck of the draw when it comes to how well the creative team pulls off getting the reader familiar with certain individual characters. But some of the stories in here, there are some standouts for sure. I mean, the one with the Scarecrow, like I said, was one of my personal favorites in terms of, say, lesser known characters that the Thing teams up with. On the other hand, you also, of course, have the classic storyline that I should say the classic story that starts the Marvel 2-in-1 plot altogether, wherein the Thing and the Incredible Hulk are pitted against one another by mutual foes, in a sense of you have a foe of the Fantastic Four, and you have a foe of the Incredible Hulk, basically putting the two of them in a situation where they have to fight each other in order to basically prove which villain is the better mastermind, like, because the Thing and the Incredible Hulk are basically pawns for these forces, and it's a really good story. I mean, with some good writing and good artwork, and then of course you have the storyline that comes after that, wherein the Thing and Iron Man, aka Tony Stark, team up to go up against this group of alien vampires called the Blood Brothers. And yes, they're vampires, but they're also strong enough to where they're able to put up a fight against both the Thing and Iron Man. And Jim Starlin did the artwork on both of those stories. But then, going from there, you have the very first issue of Marvel 2-in-1, wherein, this cover, or this back cover, is kind of a reproduction of the cover of that first issue, wherein the Thing and Man-Thing, a very popular horror character in the Marvel Universe, the two of them are on one hand, they initially fight it's a classic situation of initially there's a fight, except the way they end up fighting each other, it kind of makes sense because there's a bit where, there's a case of, the Thing, trying to prove that, hey, I'm the top dog around here, not this, Thing, calling itself Man Thing using my name, but except the Man Thing is literally like a mindless monster, and doesn't really care about the Thing. He just wants to be left alone. But then the two of them end up running afoul of this old villain of the Fantastic Fours called the Molecule Man, and so you have all this going on, and then you have both Man Thing and Ben Grimm, or the Thing and Man Thing, being turned into their human selves, and they're put in a spot where basically one of them has to sacrifice their humanity in order to defeat the Molecule Man. And it's definitely an instance where both of them, they're able, they have to sacrifice their humanity and go back to being the monsters that they were. But unfortunately, in Man Thing's case, he doesn't possess the intellect and humanity that he had when he was still human. Whereas at least the Thing, when Ben Grimm turns back into the Thing, he still has his humanity, and so it's one of those instances where he realizes that maybe he doesn't have it so bad after all, and he definitely feels a profound sense of sympathy for the Man Thing and the human that he used to be, since he had a brief moment where he regained that humanity, but then poof, it's all gone. So this collection definitely starts off rather well with those three stories, but then from there there's a series of misadventures with this sort of socially challenged, I guess you could say it's kind of like a mentally challenged Superman named Wandar, who it was, the creative team that put him together, they had to where it's like, what would have happened if Kal-El, aka Superman, had crash landed on Earth but had never left his ship. What if he had spent several years inside the ship with that being his only world, and the artificial intelligence of the ship had raised him, and so you have the answer to that scenario with the character of Wandar, who was from another. It's basically Marvel's attempt to have Superman, but in a situation wherein Superman, when he finally comes out of his ship after having crash landed on Earth, it's not as a child. Physically speaking, as a he's an adult, but and he has the power that comes with the members of his race and what have you, but he has the intellect of a child because he spent several years inside this ship, and with the artificial intelligence being the only source of guidance for him. So you have this Superman level of super being, but who has the intellect of a child, or almost like a baby. And so you have some situations that come up wherein the Thing's having to babysit the poor guy, but he keeps on getting caught up in all sorts of other misadventures, because all these villains come along, and then you have other characters that are getting involved, and the Thing's having to kind of do this juggling act here. So initially the stories with Wandar, some of them come across as kind of cute, but then he kind of starts to wear out his welcome after a while, because there's a certain formula to it, and it's good up to a point, but then it gets to where it's like, okay, we've got to do something different with this guy. And so and one of the storylines that stands out as being legitimately great, though, is a three-part storyline that starts off in an annual of the Fantastic Four, and then it goes into an annual, or I should say, the first annual of Marvel 2-in-1, and then it goes into an individual issue of Marvel 2-in-1, and it's where you got the Fantastic Four, with the Thing, being thrown back in time, wherein they meet Captain America and the Invaders, which was a World War II super team that was made of Captain America, Submariner, and the original android Human Torch, as well as his teen sidekick Toro, or I should say kid sidekick Toro. And so you have the Fantastic Four teaming up with these legends from World War II during World War II, but the whole thing is, because of a mishap involving time travel, the Nazis have won World War II, and so initially they're having to fight Nazis in the present day, as in the Fantastic Four are having to fight Nazis in the present day. But then, when they try to go back in time to try and fix this, that's how they end up meeting, the Invaders. And so it's rather, fascinating, seeing this alternate form of history, being made into the future. But it's also fascinating, watching some already classic characters, the Fantastic Four, interacting with some literally World War II legends. And so, and then from there, you have the Thing continuing into this storyline, being subtly guided by the Watcher. He ends up teaming up with, at first fighting with, and then teaming up with the Liberty Legion, which is a comparatively lesser known World War II super team that was around the same time as the Invaders. And so, and because of that, you also get to see these classic World War II villains that were around the same time as the Invaders and the Liberty Legion were. And so it's cool seeing stuff from the past being brought into the then present. And so I think I really enjoyed that particular storyline, and the creative team involved in that story tended to do a really good job, and you could tell they kind of pulled out all the stops, because on one hand it's just a straight up good comic book team up story, but it's also a good science fiction story as well. And it kind of made me think of the classic Star Trek episode where Kirk and Spock they have to go back in time to the Great Depression in order to figure out how to set things right as far as time goes, because unfortunately temporarily insane Dr. McCoy ended up going back into the past and doing something that changed history for the worse, namely with the Nazis winning World War II. So I really think that this particular storyline took a cue from that episode of the original Star Trek, except with the Marvel Universe. And so I think in terms of overall multi-part storylines or story arcs, this World War II time travel storyline was probably my favorite, with the introductory arc at the book's beginning being a very close second, because with the stories of the Thing fighting the Incredible Hulk, because it's one, it's a badass fight, and you also kind of go into the mindset of the two villains who are using these two guys as their pawns. And so it's like you have this bit wherein the Thing realizes that, yes, he knows he can put up a fight against the Hulk, but he realizes that, hey, he's doing a lot more damage than he's normally capable of doing. What's going on here? And then he realizes that the villain that's using him is basically doping him up, and so it'd be like if there was a prize fight going on and your trainer started doping you up with steroids, and you realize midway through your fight that you're like, I'm way stronger than I usually am. I shouldn't be doing this much damage to the guy. And so, there comes a bit where the Thing actually, I'm not going to say he takes a dive, but he, acts out in such a way to where he forces the fight to essentially be fair. And I thought that was, a rather nice touch because, I mean, of course, there's it's a life or death situation, but at the same time, the Thing is enough of a, I guess you could say, he's, I'm not sure if soldier is the right word, but I mean, in his own way, he's an honorable warrior. Like, when he gets into a fight, I mean, he wants to do it in a sense that, both sides have a chance. Now, granted, I mean, if he's fighting, if it's a life or death situation, I mean, obviously that, changes things, in a lot of ways in the big picture. But at the same time, he does like to, try and play fair, if he can. And so I appreciated the fact that he, went out of his way to sabotage things to where, on one hand, he would initially was coming close to beating the Hulk, but then when he realized he was doing it with some outside help, then he's like, no. If we're going to have this fight, it has to be on our own terms, that kind of thing. And so, of course, then you come up with the whole, situation of, well, the angrier Hulk gets, the stronger he gets. And so it's like, what do you do then? So, but, from the character standpoint, it definitely, made a lot of sense for the Thing to have that kind of reaction. And of course, the aforementioned, introductory issue of Marvel 2-in-1, wherein the Thing and Man-Thing end up fighting with each other and then teaming up with each other in their human forms, briefly, and then having to willingly make the sacrifice of their humanity in order to save the day. I mean, you get a lot of mileage in just one issue in terms of sheer character development. So yeah, in terms of like story arcs, the introductory arc and then that World War II time travel arc were probably my favorites. But in terms of, say, individual stories, though, I mean, I think I would probably have to say, two lesser known characters were probably my favorites. The Golem, and then of course the Scarecrow, and then I also liked the story where he teams up with Ghost Rider, aka Johnny Blaze, because they did a good enough job of keeping Blaze's characterization consistent with the stories that were going on with him at the time in his own series, which I've covered in a couple of other reviews. But I also liked how just outlandish and ridiculous the story was, wherein basically the Thing and Ghost Rider end up having to team up in order to reenact the birth of Christ, wherein you see the Thing and Ghost Rider masquerading as two of the three wise men, or in this case wise guys, in order to foil this really bizarre plot. It's a weird story, but I think the fact that both the Thing and Johnny Blaze, who at this point in time was still portrayed as a guy, just an ordinary human who happened to turn into Ghost Rider at night, but still maintain his humanity. So it's like you have two monstrous characters, who are very human in personality, being forced to go along with this rather ridiculous and contrived plan to recreate the birth of Christ, albeit through different means, and so then you're just like, okay, as weird as this is, this isn't the strangest thing that's happened to either of us. It's that kind of reaction. But because of how human in terms of personality the two characters are. I mean, that particular story, I think, was probably one of my, guilty pleasures, and just in terms of how ridiculous the story was, but, both, the characters in the story and the creative team knew how ridiculous it was and just went with it. So, that was one of my other personal favorites. But I also liked the story wherein he teams up with Khazar in the Savage Land, with Khazar's along with Khazar's saber-toothed tiger Zabu. But it was just really cool, getting to see the visuals of the Savage Land, wherein amongst other things, Khazar and Zabu and the Thing, take down a gigantic Tyrannosaurus Rex. And that was pretty badass. And so I didn't really care about the villain in the story, but at the same time, it's just the team up portion of the story, wherein Khazar and Zabu and the Thing, are working together to survive in the Savage Land. That was what made it for me, and plus just the visuals. But I will say, though, that as smart as Mr. Fantastic is, I mean, as good of a scientist as he is, I find his interaction with the Thing at times irresponsible, because he keeps on using the Thing in dangerous situations to test certain environments out, or test certain materials and what have you, and basically just assuming that the Thing is going to be able to handle whatever trouble comes his way. But because this is a Thing team up title, trouble almost always finds him. And so you would think that as smart of a scientist as Mr. Fantastic is, he would at least have a contingency plan in place for, hey, maybe we should send a backup team to go along with the Thing, instead of just sending him all on his lonesome. Because I mean, yeah, he's a hotshot pilot, but at the same time, he's not a gadgeteer genius like myself, or he's not a scientist, and yet he's sending him on scientific expeditions by himself. And it would have made more sense if he had sent him on an expedition with maybe himself and another member of the team, but he doesn't do that, though. So that is another flaw in the book in general. But overall, though, I mean, it's not a bad collection by any means. I mean, you get to sort of see what stories were like back in the day, and you definitely get to appreciate, I guess you could say, the amount of effort that went into, say, the visual aspect of storytelling back then. But in terms of the writing, though, while there are definitely good writers who are turning out good stories in this collection, it's just that, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of plot lines that are resolved in issues in other books that are not collected here. So you get a lot of storylines that end up on cliffhangers. So I'm going to go ahead and give Marvel 2-in-1 Volume 1 3 out of 5 stars. It was a decent book. I mean, it was a decent collection, and so I mean, it was entertaining, it was fun, but also it was kind of frustrating, because of the problems mentioned. But if you're a fan of the Thing or team up stories in general, I would say definitely check this one out. So, but yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. You got any questions, comments? Please drop a line, let me know. Y'all have a good night. Take care. Bye.